In this podcast episode, historian and broadcaster Rafe Heydel Mankoo and Britain's first professor of Black Studies, Kehinde engage in a detailed, at times contentious dialogue on the complex subjects of slavery, reparations, and colonialism. The debate delves deeply into historical interpretations, economic consequences, cultural analyses, and the enduring legacies of these intertwined phenomena. Kehinde opens the debate by firmly framing reparations as an undisputed moral and historical necessity. Drawing on his Jamaican heritage, he emphasizes the enduring harm caused by slavery, harm that, in his view, has never been adequately addressed. Andrews invokes Malcolm X's metaphor of a knife wound, explaining that abolition merely pulled the knife out partway, leaving lasting consequences unhealed. He highlights the fact that when Britain abolished slavery, compensation was paid exclusively to slave owners, not to the enslaved people, cementing wealth disparities and poverty that persist today. This legacy, Andrews asserts, translates into contemporary socioeconomic gaps in wealth, life expectancy, and opportunity between Black and white communities globally. For Andrews, reparations go beyond individual payments. They involve establishing dedicated funds to support and develop Black communities in the Caribbean, Britain, America, and Africa. He stresses that the damage wrought by slavery extends into colonialism, neo-colonialism, and systemic racism, all contributing to the contemporary global economic hierarchy where predominantly Black regions remain the poorest. In contrast, Rafe Heydel Mankoo presents a more skeptical view of reparations. He challenges the notion of living victims of British Empire slavery given the passage of multiple generations since abolition. Heydel Mankoo points to legal and historical records showing that compensation to slave owners was effectively settled by the early 20th century, disputing claims that taxpayers today, particularly Black descendants of enslaved people, were paying off those debts until as recently as 2014. From his perspective, reparations raise practical and conceptual problems. He argues that issues like intergenerational trauma for events 8 generations ago are difficult to justify in legal terms rooted in tort law, which seeks to restore victims to their pre-damaged state. Heydel Mankoo further asserts that much of the Caribbean's ongoing poverty stems less from colonial history and more from post-independence corruption and mismanagement by local governments, which he describes as critical obstacles to development. He pivots the argument to the pressing humanitarian crisis of modern slavery, noting that millions of people, even today, live in conditions of servitude, a plight largely ignored in reparations debates. Heydel Mankoo suggests that many reparations movements are politicized tools designed to undermine Western nations by appealing to guilt rather than addressing current injustices. One of the most contested points centers on the economic role of slavery in powering the British Industrial Revolution. Andrews emphasizes that slavery and slave-produced commodities, such as gold, silver, tobacco, indigo, sugar, and cotton, were foundational to the wealth accumulation that enabled industrialization. He notes the British government's enormous compensation to slave owners upon abolition, amounting to roughly 40% of government income at the time, as evidence of slavery's huge economic significance. Heydel Mankoo disputes this scale of impact, citing economic historians and data that place the slave trade's contribution to British national income at less than 5%, comparable to the economic effect of barley and hops cultivation. He argues that Britain's industrial success owes more to factors like agricultural revolutions, abundant natural resources, technological innovation, political stability, and financial institutions. Furthermore, he draws attention to other European slave-owning powers like Spain and Portugal, which, despite their larger slave trades, failed to industrialize comparably, suggesting that slavery was not a primary driver. Andrews counters by contextualizing the argument globally, highlighting Liverpool and Bristol as ports whose wealth depended heavily on slavery. He also notes that cotton, one of the key commodities related to the Industrial Revolution, originated largely from American slave labor, thus intertwined with the broader Atlantic system of exploitation. The debate turns to the role of Africans in the slave trade, with Heydel Mankoo noting that many captives were sold by other Africans, which he uses to challenge simplistic narratives, blaming Europeans alone. Andrews responds by clarifying that African societies varied greatly, and while some groups participated in slave trading, the system imposed by European demand radically transformed and intensified slavery, destroying African economies and undermining indigenous cultures. Both acknowledge that African traditional slavery differed from the brutal, dehumanizing chattel slavery imposed by Europeans, and that the economic and social devastation wrought on Africa by the transatlantic slave trade is indisputable. Andrews emphasizes that much of Africa's underdevelopment today, including extremely low GDP per capita and life expectancy, directly results from this historical exploitation, compounded by colonialism and neo-colonial dynamics. Heydel Mankoo points to examples of corruption and governance failures in post-colonial African states, arguing that internal factors have played a significant role in ongoing challenges. Andrews replies that these issues are part of neo-colonial structures propping up puppet governments, maintaining external control and resource extraction under new guises. Andrews advances a controversial cultural argument, asserting that Western development is linked to unique ways of thinking associated with whiteness, a concept he defines not as a phenotype, but as a set of irrational and deluded worldviews rooted in white supremacy. He ties this into the global economic disparities seen today, asserting that these are not mere coincidences, but consequences of systemic racial hierarchies stemming from colonial history. Heydel Mankoo pushes back strongly against this, describing such arguments as a form of cultural racism akin to eugenics. He warns that attributing differences between peoples to inherent cultural or cognitive traits not only echoes racist ideologies, but also distracts from pragmatic solutions. Heydel Mankoo stresses social and political factors, noting that disparities within white populations themselves, such as between Eastern and Western Europeans, complicate simplistic racialized explanations. The two find tentative agreement, acknowledging that Western cultures have fostered particular institutional innovations, including individualism, scientific inquiry, and social trust, that contributed to economic success. However, Andrews critiques this very worldview as enabling the dehumanization necessary for slavery, colonialism, and environmental devastation, underscoring the double-edged nature of Western modernity. The discussion moves to the legacies of colonial withdrawal and independence. Heydel Mankoo maintains that Britain invested significantly in colonial infrastructure, governance, education, and healthcare, providing a framework for the development of former colonies. He credits British imperial governance with creating relatively stable institutions and argues that much of the failure of former colonies to thrive results from corruption and mismanagement. Conversely, Andrews highlights structural constraints imposed by colonialism that deliberately underdeveloped African and Caribbean economies. He describes independence in many cases as nominal, with economic control and wealth extraction continuing through neo-colonial mechanisms. Jamaica, for example, is portrayed as trapped in systemic poverty with continued capital flight and lack of genuine economic sovereignty. Both acknowledge that many in the Caribbean express nostalgia for colonial rule as a reflection of dissatisfaction with present-day governance rather than a genuine endorsement of past exploitation. Despite significant disagreements, the two scholars find some common ground in recognizing the enduring impact of slavery and colonialism. Heydel Mankoo agrees that the historical injustices of slavery were horrific and demanding of remembrance, though he remains cautious about assigning victimhood across multiple generations. Andrews insists that lasting economic disparities and trauma necessitate reparatory justice beyond symbolic recognition. The debate closes with reflections on the nature of whiteness, European exceptionalism, and the need for honest reckoning with historical truth. Both stress the importance of nuanced, open discussion free from ideological obfuscation, and acknowledge that any lasting solutions will require both acknowledgement of past wrongs and internal cultural and institutional reforms within affected communities.